Thursday, March 11th, 1971, interfacing. Janet Ross sat in the empty room and glanced at the wall clock. It was 9 a.m. She looked down at the desk in front of her, which was bare except for a vase of flowers and a notepad. She looked at the chair opposite her. Then aloud she said, "How are we doing?" There was a mechanical click, and Gerhard's voice came through the speaker, mounted in the ceiling. "We need a few minutes for the sound levels. The light is okay. You want to talk a minute?" She nodded and glanced over her shoulder at the one-way mirror behind her. She saw only her reflection, but she knew Gerhard, with his equipment, was behind, watching her. "You sound tired," she said. "Trouble with St. George last night," Gerhard said. "I'm tired too," she said. "I was having trouble with somebody who isn't a saint." She laughed. She was just talking so they could get a sound level for the room. She hadn't really paid attention to what she was saying. But it was true. Arthur was no saint. He was also no great discovery, though she thought he might be a few weeks ago when she first met him. She had been, in fact, infatuated with him. Infatuated? Is that what you'd call it? She could hear Dr. Ramos now. Arthur had been born handsome and wealthy. He had a yellow Ferrari, a lot of dash, and a lot of charm. She was able to feel it feminine and frivolous around him. He did madcap, dashing things like flying her to Mexico City for dinner because he knew a little restaurant where they made the best tacos in the world. She knew it was all silly, but she enjoyed it, and in a way she was relieved she never had to talk about medicine or the hospital or psychiatry. Arthur wasn't interested in any of those things. He was interested in her as a woman, not as a sex object. Damn Dr. Ramos. Then, as she got to know him better, she found herself wanting to talk about her work, and she found with some surprise that Arthur didn't want to hear about it. Arthur was threatened by her work. He had problems about achievement. He was nominally a stockbroker, an easy thing for a rich man's son to be, and he talked with authority about money, investments, interest rates, and bond issues. But there was an aggressive quality in his manner, a defensiveness, as if he were substantiating himself. And then she realized what she should have known from the beginning, that Arthur was chiefly interested in her because she was substantial. It was, in theory, more difficult to impress her, to sweep her off her feet, than it was to impress the little actresses who hung out at Bumble's and the candy store, and therefore more satisfying. Finally, her role had begun to bother her, and she no longer drew pleasure from being frivolous around him, and everything became vaguely depressing. She recognized all the signs. Her work at the hospital became busier, and she had to break dates with him. When she did see him, she was bored by his flamboyance, his restless and impulsiveness, his clothes, and his cars. She would look at him across the dinner table and try to find what she had once seen. She could not find even a trace of it. Last night she had broken it off. They both knew it was coming. Why did it depress her? "You stop talking," Gerhard said. "I don't know what to say. Now is the time for all good men to come to the aid of the patient." The quick brown fox jumped over the pithed frog. "We are all headed for the final common pathway in the sky." She paused. "Is that enough?" "A little more. Mary, quite contrary. How does your garden grow?" "I'm sorry, I don't remember the rest." "How does the poem go?" She laughed. "That's fine. We have the level now." She looked up at the loudspeaker. "Will you be interfacing at the end of the series?" "Probably," Gerhard said, "if it goes well. Roger's in a hurry to get him into tranquilizers." She nodded. This was the final stage in Benson's treatment, and it had to be done before tranquilizers could be administered. Benson had been kept on sedation, the phenobarbital unit, midnight the night before. He would be clear-headed this morning and ready for interfacing. It was McPherson's who had coined the term interfacing. McPherson liked computer terminology. An interface was the boundary between two systems, or between a computer and an effector mechanism. In Benson's case, it was almost a boundary between two computers. His brain and the little computer wired into his shoulder. The wires had been attached, but the switches hadn't been thrown yet. Once they were, the feedback loop of Benson's computer Benson would be instituted. McPherson saw this case as the first of many. He planned to go from epileptics to schizophrenics, to mentally retarded patients, to blind patients. The charts were all there on his office wall. And he planned to use more and more sophisticated computers in the link-ups. Eventually, he would get to projects like Form Q, which seemed far-fetched even to Ross. But today the practical question was, which of the 40 electrodes would prevent an attack? Nobody knew that yet. It would be determined experimentally. During the operation, the electrodes had been located precisely, within millimeters of the target area. This was a good surgical placement, but Considering the density of the brain, it was grossly inadequate. A nerve cell in the brain was just a micron in diameter. There were 1,000 nerve cells in the space of a millimeter. From that standpoint, the electrodes had been crudely positioned, and the crudeness meant that many electrodes were required. One could assume that if you placed several electrodes in the correct general areas, at least one of them would be in the precise position to abort an attack. Trial and error stimulation would determine the proper electrode to use. "Patient coming," Gerhard said over the loudspeaker. A moment later, Benson arrived in a wheelchair, wearing his blue and white striped bathrobe. He seemed alert as he waved to her stiffly. The shoulder bandages inhibited movement of his arm. "How are you feeling?" he said, and smiled. "I'm supposed to ask you." "I'll ask the questions around here," he said. He was still smiling, but there was an edge to his voice. With some surprise, she realized that he was afraid, and then she wondered why that surprised her. Of course he was afraid. Anyone would be. She wasn't exactly calm herself. The nurse patted Benson on the shoulder, nodded to Dr. Ross, and left the room. They were alone. For a moment, neither spoke. Benson stared at her. She stared back. She wanted to give Gerhard time to focus the TV camera in the ceiling and to prepare his stimulating equipment. "What are we doing today?" Benson asked. "We're going to stimulate your electrodes sequentially to see what happens." He nodded. He seemed to take this calmly, but she had learned not to trust his calm. After a moment, he said, "Will it hurt?" "No." "Okay," he said. "Go ahead." Gerhard, sitting on a high stool in the adjacent room, surrounded in the darkness by glowing green dials of equipment, watched through the one-way glasses. Ross and Benson began to talk. Alongside him, Richards picked up the tape recorder microphone and said quietly, "Stimulation Series 1, Patient Harold Benson, March 11th, 1971. Gerhard looked at the 4 TV screens in front of him. One showed the closed-circuit view of Benson that would be stored on videotape as the stimulation series proceeded. Another displayed a computer-generated view of the 40 electrode points lined up in 2 parallel rows within the brain substance. As each electrode was stimulated, the appropriate point glowed on the screen. A third TV screen ran an oscilloscope, tracing of the shock pulse as it was delivered, and the fourth showed a wiring diagram of the tiny computer in Benson's neck. It also glowed as stimulations traveled through the circuit pathways. In the next room, Ross was saying, "You'll feed a variety of sensations, and some of them may be quite pleasant. We want you to tell us what you feel, all right?" Benson nodded. Richard said, "Electrode 1, 5 millivolts for 5 seconds." Gerhard pressed the buttons. The computer diagram showed a tracing of the circuit being closed. The current shaking its way through the intricate electronic maze of Benson's shoulder computer. They watched Benson through the one-way glass. Benson said, "That's interesting." What's interesting?" Ross said. "That feeling? Can you describe it?" "Well, it's like eating a ham sandwich." "Do you like ham sandwiches?" Benson shrugged. "Not particularly." "Do you feel hungry?" "Not particularly." "Do you feel anything else?" "No, just the taste of a ham sandwich." He smiled. "On rye." Gerhard, sitting at the control panel, nodded. The first electrode had stimulated a vague memory trace. Richard's electrode 2, 5 millivolts, 5 seconds. Benson said, "I have to go to the bathroom." Ross said, "It will pass." Gerhard sat back from the control panel, sipped a cup of coffee, and watched the interview progress. Electrode 3, 5 millivolts, 5 seconds. This one produced absolutely no effect on Benson. Benson was quietly talking with Ross about bathrooms in restaurants, hotels, airports. "Try it again," Gerhard said. "Up 5. Repeat electrode 3, 10 millivolts, 5 seconds. Richard said. The TV screen flashed the circuit through electrode 3. There was still no effect. "Go on to 4, Gerhard said. He wrote out a few notes. Number 1, dash, question mark. Memory trace, ham sand. Number 2, dash, bladder, fullness. Number 3, dash, no subjective change. Number 4, dash. He drew the dash and waited. It was going to take a long time to go through all the 40 electrodes, but it was fascinating to watch. They produced such strikingly different effects, yet each electrode was very close to the next. It was the ultimate proof of the density of the brain, which had once been described as the most complex structure in the known universe. And it was certainly true. There was 3 times as many cells packed into a single human brain as there were human beings on the face of the earth. The density was hard to comprehend. Sometimes early in his NPS career, Gerhard had requested a human brain to dissect. He had done it over a period of several days, with a dozen neutron anatomy texts opened up before him. He used the traditional tool for brain dissection, a blunt wooden stick, to scrape away the cheesy gray material. He had patiently, carefully scraped away, and in the end he had nothing. The brain was not like a liver or the lungs to the naked eye. It was uniform and boring. giving no indication of its true function. The brain was too subtle, too complex, too dense. Electrode 4, Richard said, into the recorder, 5 millivolts, 5 seconds. The shock was delivered, and Benson, in an oddly childlike voice, said, "Could I have some milk and cookies, please?" "That's interesting," Gerhard said, watching the reaction. Richards nodded. "How old would you say?" "About 5 or 6 at most." Benson was talking about cookies, talking about his tricycle to Ross. Slowly, over the next few minutes, he seemed to emerge like a time traveler advancing through the years. Finally, he became fully adult again, thinking back to his youth, instead of actually being 3. "I always wanted the cookies, and she would never give them to me. She said they were bad for me and would give me cavities." "We can go on," Gerhard said. Richard said, "Electrode 5, 5 millivolts, 5 seconds." In the next room, Benson shifted uncomfortably in his wheelchair. Ross asked him if something was wrong. Benson said, "It feels funny." "How do you mean?" "I can't describe it. It's like sandpaper. Irritating." Gerhard nodded and wrote in his notes, "Number 5, potential attack electrode." This happened sometimes. Occasionally, an electrode would be found to stimulate a seizure. Nobody knew why, and Gerhard personally thought that nobody ever would. The brain was, he believed, beyond comprehension. His work with programs like George and Martha had led him to understand that relatively simple computer instructions could produce complex and unpredictable machine behavior. It was also true that the program machine could exceed the capabilities of the programmer. That was clearly demonstrated in 1963, when author Samuel IBM programmed a machine to play checkers, and the machine eventually became so good that it beat Samuel himself. Yet all this was done with computers, which had no more circuits than the brain of an ant. The human brain far exceeded that complexity, and the programming of the human brain extended over many decades. How could anyone seriously expect to understand it? There was also a philosophical problem, Gödel's theorem, that no system could explain itself, and no machine could understand its own workings. At most, Gerhard believed that a human brain might, after years of work, decipher a frog brain, but a human brain could never decipher itself in the same detail. For that, you would need a superhuman brain. Gerhard thought that someday a computer would be developed that could untangle the billions of cells and hundreds of billions of interconnections in the human brain. Then at last, man would have the information that he wanted. But man wouldn't have done the work. Another order of intelligence would have done it. And man would not know, of course, how the computer worked. Morris entered the room with a cup of coffee. He sipped it and glanced at Benson through the glass. "How's he holding up?" "Okay," Gerhard said. "Electrode 6, 5 and 5, intoned in the next room." Benson failed to react. He sat talking with Ross about the apparition and his lingering headache. He was quite calm, apparently unaffected. They repeated the stimulation, still without change in Benson's behavior. Then they went on. "Electrode 7, 5 and 5, Richard said. He delivered the shock. Benson sat up abruptly. "Oh," he said, "that was nice." "What was?" Ross said. You can do that again if you want to." "How does it feel?" "Nice," Benson said. His whole appearance seemed to change subtly. "You know," he said, after a moment, "you're really a wonderful person, Dr. Ross." "Thank you," she said. "Very attractive, too. I don't know if I ever told you that before." "How do you feel now?" "I'm really very fond of you," Benson said. "I don't know if I told you that before." "Nice," Gerhard said, watching through the glass. "Very nice." Morris nodded. A strong P-terminal he's clearly turned on. Gerhard made a note of it. Morris sipped his coffee. They waited until Benson settled down. Then blandly, Richard said, "Electrode 8, 5 millivolts, 5 seconds." The stimulation series continued.